Clara Whitmore did not cry when her husband told a room full of powerful men that their marriage was nothing but obligation. She stood perfectly still, her gloved hand pressed flat against the cold marble column, and let the music swallow his words whole. She had loved this man in silence for 3 years. 3 years of waiting to matter. That night something inside her did not break it closed. Quietly. Finally. If you've ever loved someone who refused to see you, this story will find every corner of your heart. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1816 arrived in Virginia like a slow fire, heavy, relentless, pressing down on everything, the full weight of a season that refused to apologize for itself. The fields around Ashford House shimmered under a white sky, and every family of consequence within 40 miles had dressed in their finest and driven their carriages toward the Harrington Assembly Hall, where the polished floors and tall windows made ordinary people feel for one evening at least like they amounted to something. Clara Ashford. Born Clara Whitmore, a name she still carried inside her like a pressed flower between the pages of a book she was no longer allowed to read, stood near the east column of the ballroom and watched the room move without her. She was 24 years old. She had been Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she had learned the particular art of being invisible inside a marriage. She wore a pale blue gown that evening, the color of early morning before the heat arrived. Her dark hair was pinned simply without the elaborate curls the other women favored. She had no jewels except a small pearl at each ear, a gift from her mother, long before the Whitmore name had become something people lowered their voices around. She stood straight. She always stood straight. It was the one thing her father had given her that Silas Harrow and county gossip and 3 years of cold silence had never managed to take. Across the room her husband stood at the center of a circle of men. Nathaniel Ashford was 33, tall enough to command space without trying, broad-shouldered, in a way that suggested both physical strength and an absolute refusal to be moved by anything outside his own judgment. His dark coat was pressed perfectly. His jaw was set in that familiar way, not hostile exactly, but closed like a door that had been locked from the inside so long the key had been forgotten. He was the most powerful man in the county, and he wore that power the way other men wore hats naturally, without thinking about it, as though it had simply always been there. Clara watched him from across the ballroom and felt, as she often did, the particular ache of loving someone who looked through you like glass. She had not meant to move closer. She told herself later that she had simply been trying to find a cooler spot near the window, that the evening air had grown too thick inside, and she had only been looking for somewhere quiet to breathe. But her feet carried her along the far edge of the room, past the potted ferns, and the chattering wives, past old Judge Calloway and his deaf brother-in-law, until she was close enough to the circle of men to catch the low current of conversation rising above the fiddle music. She heard her husband's voice first. She always recognized it before any other sound in a room. That was the particular cruelty of loving someone. Your body learned them before your mind had time to protect itself. "Ashford," said one of the men. She recognized the voice as belonging to Preston Mercer, a land speculator from Richmond who smelled of tobacco and self-satisfaction. "I've always wondered. The Whitmore girl. You married beneath the family name, no question. Was that entirely your own decision, or did your father arrange it before he died?" There was a brief pause. Clara stopped walking. "A family obligation," Nathaniel said. His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man answering a question he found mildly boring. Nothing more. The Whitmore situation was difficult. The marriage was the practical solution. Laughter moved through the circle. Not cruel laughter, which almost would have been easier to bear, but the comfortable laughter of men who found nothing remarkable in what had just been said, because in their world, women were frequently described in exactly those terms, and that was simply the order of things. Clara stood with her hand pressed flat against the marble column. She did not move. She did not make a sound. The music continued. A real, lively and bright something meant to lift the spirits and move the feet. Around her, couples stepped and turned and laughed. Mrs. Harrington was admiring her daughter's new sash. 3 young men near the punch bowl were arguing passionately about horse breeding. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Ashford, stood still at the edge of all of it and felt the full weight of 3 years settle onto her shoulders at once. A family obligation, nothing more. She had known in some quiet and practical corner of herself that their marriage had not been a love match. She was not a foolish woman. She had understood from the beginning that Nathaniel Ashford had not chosen her the way a man chooses something he desires. He had chosen her the way a man signs a document deliberately, without sentiment, because the circumstances required it. She had told herself that was enough, that respect and security and the protection of his name were sufficient, that she could live in the space beside a man without ever truly being seen by him, and that over time, perhaps the space might grow smaller. She had been wrong. She understood that now, standing in the middle of a ballroom, in her pale blue gown, with the marble column cold against her palm, and the fiddle music bright and indifferent above her head, she turned and walked to the terrace. The night air was warm but thinner than the air inside, and it hit her face like the first honest thing she'd felt all evening. She gripped the stone railing with both hands and looked out over the dark garden where fireflies moved in slow drifts, and the distant fields were black and heavy under a half moon. Behind her the music and voices continued, sealed behind the tall glass doors, as though nothing had occurred. Nothing had occurred. That was the precise nature of the wound. She had not been struck. She had not been publicly shamed. Her husband had not even looked at her while he said it. A family obligation, nothing more spoken the way a man mentions the weather, or the state of the roads, or any other arrangement that exists in the background of life without requiring particular feeling. She stood on the terrace for a long time. When the glass doors opened behind her, she did not turn around. "Clara," Nathaniel's voice was careful. Not soft. Never soft. She had stopped expecting that, but careful in the way a man sounds when he is checking on property he wants to ensure is undamaged. "The evening is nearly over," he said. "The Mercers are leaving. We should make our farewell." "Of course," she said. She turned from the railing. She smoothed the front of her gown. She looked at her husband standing in the doorway, the light from the ballroom outlining his shoulders, his expression unreadable in the way she had spent 3 years trying to read. "Are you well?" he asked, because the social script required it. "I am perfectly well," she said, because the social script required that too. She walked past him through the glass doors and spent the next 40 minutes saying polite farewells to people who had always treated her as a footnote to her husband's importance, and she did it with her back straight and her voice steady and her face arranged in an expression of such composed pleasantness that not a single person in that room would have guessed that something had just quietly ended inside her. The carriage ride back to Ashford House took nearly an hour on the summer roads, and Nathaniel sat across from her in the dark and offered her exactly what he always offered: polite silence. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He did not shout. He did not demean her in front of the servants. He paid her bills and maintained her wardrobe and kept the house cold in winter and cool in summer, and never once failed to provide for her material comfort. These were the things he gave, because they were the things a man of his position was expected to give, and Nathaniel Ashford did not fail to meet expectations. What he did not give, what he had never given, not once in 3 years, was the simple act of looking at her like she mattered. The carriage rolled on through the dark Virginia night, and Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at nothing, and Nathaniel looked out the window at the passing road, and the silence between them was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Finally, because she was tired, and because the evening had stripped away whatever remained of her restraint, she said, "Nathaniel." He turned from the window. "Yes." "At the assembly tonight." She kept her voice level. Quiet. She was not accusing. She was simply at last speaking. "Preston Mercer asked you about our marriage." A pause. "He asks about a great many things that are none of his concern." "You called it a family obligation," Clara said. "Nothing more." Nathaniel held her gaze for a moment in the darkness. His jaw moved slightly the way it did when he was calculating something. It is an accurate description of the arrangement." "Yes," Clara said. "I know." She turned back to the window. Nathaniel said nothing further. The carriage arrived at Ashford House, and the footman opened the door, and Nathaniel stepped down first and offered her his hand, as he always did, with the practiced correctness of a man who knew his obligations. And Clara took it, as she always did, with the practiced composure of a woman who had learned to accept exactly what was offered and ask for nothing more. She went upstairs alone. She sat at the edge of her bed in the dark, still in her pale blue gown, and she pressed her palms flat against her knees, and she breathed slowly, and she looked at the wall. She had loved this man since she was 19 years old. She had loved him when her family's name began to fall apart, when her father's debts came due, and the county started whispering, when she had nothing left to offer except herself. She had loved him quietly, without demand, without complaint, in the particular way of a woman who has been taught that love given humbly is the only kind a woman of her circumstances is permitted to offer. He had married her. He had given her protection and position and his name. He had never once looked at her like she was worth looking at. Clara sat in the dark for a long time. Then something happened that had not happened before. She stopped waiting. Not in the visible, declarative way of a woman making a dramatic decision. There was no moment of sudden revelation, no tears, no resolve spoken aloud to the empty room. It was quieter than that. It was the way a door closes when the latch finally settles, not slammed, not thrown open, simply resting into the frame with a small and final click. She had been waiting for 3 years. Waiting for him to look at her. Waiting for him to speak her name with something other than duty in his voice. Waiting to feel inside her own house like a person who deserved to be there. She was done. The next morning, Nathaniel's mother came down to breakfast. Margaret Ashford was 61 years old, a woman built from Virginia granite and old money contempt, and she had made her opinion of the Whitmore marriage known from the moment Nathaniel had announced it. She had never shouted, the Ashford family did not shout, but she had never once allowed Clara to forget that she had arrived at this table with nothing, and had therefore earned nothing. Clara was already seated when Margaret appeared. The morning was already thick with summer heat, the kind that pressed in through the windows even before 8 o'clock. Clara had slept little and eaten less, but she sat at the table with her back straight and her hands composed around her coffee cup, because whatever happened inside her last night remained private and her own. Nathaniel came in 3 minutes later, moving with that unhurried authority that always filled whatever room he entered. He took his chair at the head of the table. The servants moved efficiently around him. Everything in the morning had the texture of routine that had been practiced so long it had become indistinguishable from inevitability. Margaret unfolded her napkin and said without looking up, "I heard you were on the terrace alone for quite some time last night, Clara. The Mercer women were talking." "The evening was warm," Clara said. "The evening was warm for everyone." Margaret lifted her coffee cup. "A woman who leaves her husband's side at an assembly invites commentary. You ought to know that by now." Clara said nothing. "Your mother," Margaret continued, tilting the word very slightly, the way a knife is tilted to catch light, was never known for her social judgment. "I suppose these things are learned at home." The table was quiet. Clara kept her hands still around her cup. She had heard variations of this speech many times. The references to her mother. The references to her father's debts. The delicate, persistent implication that Clara's very presence in this house was a kind of charitable concession that should produce continuous gratitude rather than independent opinion. She had always absorbed it in silence. She absorbed it now. But from across the table, Nathaniel said, "That is enough, Mother." His voice was not loud. It rarely was. Margaret looked at her son with the expression of a woman who had not expected to be interrupted. "I am simply observing. You are simply making observations you have made before," Nathaniel said, "and I would prefer a quiet breakfast." He looked back at his plate. "Clara is Mrs. Ashford. That is the end of the matter." The table settled into silence. Clara looked at her husband for one long moment. "Mrs. Ashford. That is the end of the matter," She waited to feel something warm at those words, some proof that the defense meant what it sounded like. But Nathaniel had already returned to his food, his expression unchanged. His attention moved on, and she understood with a quiet and precise clarity that he had not defended her. He had defended the Ashford name. She was Mrs. Ashford. That was the extent of it. She set down her coffee cup. "Thank you," she said, because courtesy required it. "It is nothing," he said, because that was precisely what it was. The morning after Clara rose before anyone else in the house was awake. She changed into her simplest dress, sturdy cotton, not lawn, not silk, and pulled her hair back without ceremony, and walked out the back of Ashford House while the dew was still on the grass, and the summer sun was just beginning to press its first real heat against the sky. She walked to the tenant plots. The Ashford land ran for several hundred acres, and on the far eastern section, a row of tenant families worked fields and cottages that were by every measure of the law maintained at Nathaniel's pleasure. Clara had ridden past them many times in the carriage. She had never stopped. That morning she stopped. The first family she encountered was the Cooper's husband and wife. 4 children, a leaking roof that had already rotted 2 of the interior support beams. Gideon Cooper was standing outside, looking at the roof with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem that had no good solution and no good timing. "Mr. Cooper," Clara said, "how long has that beam been like that?" He looked at her the way tenant farmers looked at women from the main house, with cautious uncertainty, unsure whether he was being inspected or addressed. "Ma'am, since spring. We've patched it twice, but the wood's gone bad up top." "Do you have timber?" "Some, not enough." "I'll speak to the estate manager about additional timber," Clara said. "What else do you need?" He stared at her. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "I'm asking you directly, what else does your family need?" By the time the morning was half gone, Clara had walked the entire eastern row of tenant plots. She had a list inside her head of roof repairs and medicine shortages, and a family, the Aldridges, whose youngest child had been running a fever for 2 weeks, and who had not seen a physician because the nearest doctor charged more than they earned in a month. She went back to the house and found Thomas, the estate manager, in his office near the stable. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, standing quickly, "I need timber allocated for the Cooper roof," she said. "And I need to know why the Aldridge child has not been seen by a physician." Thomas looked extremely uncomfortable. "The estate budget is managed by my husband, I know," Clara said. "I'm asking you what the practical obstacle is." "The practical obstacle," Thomas said carefully, "is that no one has authorized it, ma'am." "I am authorizing it," Clara said. "I am the mistress of this house. Put it on the household account. If Mr. Ashford objects, tell him I instructed you." Thomas opened his mouth. Clara looked at him steadily. Thomas closed his mouth. "Yes, ma'am." She spent the rest of that day, and every subsequent day that week, among the tenant families. She brought food when the kitchen had surplus. She organized the older children to carry messages and supplies between plots. She sat with Margaret Aldridge while the fever broke in her youngest daughter, and she held the child's hand, and she said quiet things about hope, and about the particular stubbornness of children who want very much to live. The Aldridge girl's name was June. She was 4 years old. When the fever finally broke on a Thursday afternoon, and June opened her eyes and whispered for water, her mother pressed her face into her hands and wept with relief, and Clara sat beside her and said nothing, because some moments did not need words, only witness. Nobody in the main house particularly noticed that Clara had changed her mornings. Nathaniel rode out in a different direction. Margaret spent her mornings writing correspondence and criticizing the housemaids. The servants moved around Clara's new routine with the quiet adaptability of people who were accustomed to adjusting without being asked to explain why. But on the eastern edge of the Ashford land, something was different. People had started to look at Clara the way nobody in the main house had looked at her since she arrived. Like she was there. It was on a Thursday, the second week of July, the summer pressing hard against everything, that she first properly met Dr. Samuel Reed. He arrived at the Aldridge cottage with his bag and his rolled sleeves and the particular brisk competence of a physician who has spent years covering too many miles for too many patients and has learned to use his time without waste. He had received her message through Thomas, and he had come. He was 29, not tall, but precise in his movements, with an open face, and the kind of eyes that assessed situations rather than performed for them. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, shaking her hand without the careful hesitation that most men applied to women of her station. "I heard the Aldridge girl is improving." "She is," Clara said. "I wanted you to see her yourself and make sure we haven't missed anything." He examined June with the thoroughness of a man who took small patients seriously, and he asked Clara quiet questions as he worked. How long had the fever been elevated? What had she been given? How was her water intake? And Clara answered with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention. When he finished, he straightened and looked at Clara with an expression that she could not immediately identify because she had not seen it often. "You kept good records," he said. "I wrote everything down," she said. "You probably saved this child from a secondary infection." He said it plainly, without sentimentality, as a man states a fact. "Most people wait too long." Clara said, "I couldn't wait." Samuel Reed looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I can see that." They walked back along the Tennant Road together in the morning heat, and he told her about the families he'd been treating across the county, and she told him what she had observed on the estate, and they talked with the ease of two people who have discovered unexpectedly that they are thinking about the same things, and that discovery is its own particular pleasure. It was the first conversation Clara had held in 3 years where she had not felt herself translating every word she said through the filter of what a woman in her position was supposed to sound like. She did not think about it as anything more than that. But 3 days later, Nathaniel came home from riding the northern acreage and found his wife standing at the edge of the Cooper field talking with Dr. Samuel Reed. Clara was laughing, not the polite, managed smile she offered at assemblies and dinner tables, not the careful expression of social pleasantness that she maintained in the main house. She was laughing at something Samuel had said fully and without restraint, her head tilted slightly back, her whole face open. Nathaniel pulled his horse to a stop. He sat very still for a moment. Clara had not looked like that in 3 years. He had not known until that precise moment, standing in the summer heat with his horse still beneath him, that he had never seen his wife's face look like that. Something moved through him that he did not have an immediate name for. It was not pleasant. He rode on without stopping because a man of his position did not stand in the middle of his own field and stare at his wife like a man who had just discovered something he should have been paying attention to a long time ago. But that evening at supper, he watched Clara across the table. She was talking quietly with Thomas about the eastern well that needed clearing. Her hands moved when she talked. He had not noticed that before. She had opinions about the well. She spoke to Thomas without the careful deference she used with most of the house. She spoke like someone who had made a decision and was communicating it clearly. She did not look at Nathaniel. She had used to look at him. Small, brief glances across the table, hoping he would speak to her, hoping he would notice. He had noticed. He had never let himself respond to them, because responding required opening something he had kept sealed since before she had ever arrived at his house. Now she was not looking at him at all, and the absence of those glances, the precise absence of something he had never deserved and had not valued, and had therefore been incapable of losing until this moment, sat in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He did not say anything. He was Nathaniel Ashford. He did not say things he was not prepared to say correctly. But that night, for the first time in 3 years, he lay awake in the dark and thought about his wife. Nathaniel Ashford was not a man who lost sleep. He had slept through storms that knocked shutters from their frames. He had slept the night before signing documents that transferred more wealth than most men in the county would see in 3 generations. He had slept the night after his father's funeral with the particular blankness of a man who had long since made his peace with the fact that grief was a luxury his family did not practice. But he lay awake that night, thinking about the sound of his wife laughing. He could not stop hearing it. That was the precise and inconvenient truth of it. He had ridden past her and Samuel Reed at the edge of the Cooper field, and he had heard her laugh the way he had never heard her laugh in 3 years of marriage, and now he was lying in the dark of his own house, with that sound replaying in his head like a fiddle tune you cannot shake once it gets into you. He told himself it was a matter of propriety. A married woman laughing openly with a country physician on the edge of a tenant field was a thing that invited commentary. And commentary was a thing the Ashford name did not need. He told himself it was a practical concern. He told himself a great many things in the dark, and none of them were the actual thing. But he was very good at not looking at the actual thing. So he pressed it down and closed his eyes and waited for morning. Morning came with Thomas at the door before 8 o'clock. "The Aldridge well," Thomas said, standing in the hall with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Ashford has requested the Eastern cruise be redirected for 3 days to clear and shore it up. I wanted to confirm you'd authorize the change, sir." Nathaniel looked at him. "She made that request herself." "Yes, sir. And the Cooper timber. And the medicine run to the Jennings family last Tuesday." Thomas paused carefully. "She's been directing the household account toward the tenant plots for about 2 weeks now. Everything's been documented. I have the ledger if you want it." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. "She told you to charge it to the household account," he said. "Yes, sir." "Then it's authorized," Nathaniel said. "Redirect the cruise." Thomas left. Nathaniel stood in the hallway for a moment longer than he needed to, then walked downstairs. Clara was not at the breakfast table. She had already gone out. He found out from the kitchen girl that Mrs. Ashford had been rising before sunup every morning for 2 weeks. That she walked the eastern plots before the heat peaked. That the tenant families had started keeping a watch for her the way you keep a watch for something you have come to depend on without quite meaning to. That June Aldridge, the child who had been feverish and fragile 3 weeks ago, had been seen running between the cottages that morning, her color good, her voice loud, chasing a dog that had gotten into someone's washing. Nathaniel ate breakfast alone. He ate breakfast alone every morning. That had not changed. But this morning, the empty chair across from him had a different quality than it usually did, and he was honest enough with himself privately in the part of himself that he showed no one to acknowledge that the difference was not the chairs. Margaret came in late, as she often did, and settled across from him with her coffee and her correspondence, and her quiet practiced authority over every room she entered. "I saw Clara going out again this morning," she said without looking up from her letter. "Before breakfast. In that dreadful cotton dress." "She's working," Nathaniel said. "She's playing charity," Margaret said. "There is a difference. A woman of her position does not spend her mornings in tenant fields. It is undignified. It invites speculation about what she is doing there and why." Nathaniel put down his fork. "The Eastern tenants have been short on maintenance for 2 years," he said. "The Cooper roof has needed attention since spring. The Aldridge child nearly died from a fever that proper medical attention would have caught early. Those are failures of this estate's management, not of my wife's dignity." Margaret looked up. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had not expected resistance. "She is involving herself in things that are not her concern," Margaret said more carefully now. "They are absolutely her concern," Nathaniel said. "She is the mistress of this house." The words came out with more force than he had intended. He heard them land in the room and did not take them back. Margaret said nothing further. She returned to her correspondence. The silence between them was the particular silence of a woman recalibrating, storing something away for later use, and Nathaniel recognized it and did not care. He pushed back from the table and went to find his wife. He found her at the Jennings plot, kneeling beside an older woman, Mrs. Jennings' widow, bad leg, no children left nearby, helping her sort through a basket of dried herbs with the focused attention of someone who had been taught nothing about this and was learning it entirely by listening. Clara was asking questions. Mrs. Jennings was answering. The old woman was talking the way people talk when they have not been talked to in a while, with a loosening quality, like a gate long rusted, that had finally been oiled back into motion. Nathaniel stopped at the edge of the yard. Clara did not look up. She did not hear him. She was entirely present in that moment, entirely given over to it, and there was something in the quality of her attention, the way she leaned slightly forward, the way her hands moved carefully over the herb bundles, the way she received what Mrs. Jennings said with full and unguarded openness, that made him stop in a way that had nothing to do with manners or position or any of the things he was accustomed to using as reasons for stopping. He watched his wife for a long moment. Then Mrs. Jennings looked up and saw him, and her expression shifted with the quick wariness of a tenant who has just been caught in the unexpected company of the estate owner's wife. Clara turned. She looked at him across the yard. Her expression was composed but not closed, not the careful neutrality she used with him at the breakfast table or in the evening parlor. It was simpler than that. She simply looked at him the way you look at someone who has appeared somewhere you didn't expect them. "Nathaniel," she said. "Clara." He nodded to Mrs. Jennings. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Jennings managed a small nod and found something urgent to do with her hands. There was a silence that had too many things in it for its length. "I spoke with Thomas," Nathaniel said, "about the well and the Cooper roof." "I know," Clara said. "You should have told me directly." Something moved across Clara's face. Not anger, something quieter than anger, and somehow more difficult to look at. "I tried telling you things directly for 3 years," she said. "I found it was more efficient to simply do them." Nathaniel held her gaze. He had a great many things he was capable of saying in a great many situations. He was not at this particular moment capable of saying any of them. "The crews will be redirected for 3 days," he said. "The well will be shored before the end of the week." "Thank you," Clara said. She turned back to Mrs. Jennings, and the conversation resumed, and Nathaniel walked back toward the main house in the summer heat, with the feeling of a man who has just walked into a room and discovered he is not the most important person in it, and that this discovery has arrived approximately 3 years too late. The following Saturday brought a different kind of heat. Word had gone through the county that Dr. Samuel Reed would be holding a small medical consultation at the Cooper's barn. Nothing official, simply an informal gathering where families who couldn't afford regular visits could bring their sick and their worried and their questions. Clara had helped organize it. She had sent word through Thomas, arranged for the estate kitchen to send food, and walked down herself before 9 in the morning to make sure the space was ready. By 10 o'clock, 7 families had gathered. By 11, there were 12. Samuel worked steadily through them, patient and precise, and Clara moved between the families with the ease of someone who had spent enough time among them to know their names, their children's names, who was proud and needed to be approached carefully, and who was frightened and needed a hand on their arm and a plain-spoken reassurance. She translated between Samuel's medical language and the plain English of people who had never had a physician explain things to them directly, and she did it without condescension, without impatience, without any of the careful social calculation she deployed in the main house. Samuel noticed. "You're good at this," he said during a brief pause between families. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without flattery, as a simple observation of fact. "I'm learning," Clara said. "No." He shook his head. "Learning is what you do with technique. What you're doing is something else. You understand what people need before they can say it." He looked at her steadily. "That's not learned. That's who you are." Clara looked at him. She did not know precisely what to do with being seen that clearly by someone who had no particular reason to see her at all. It was a small and ordinary kindness, the kind that costs the giver nothing but lands on the receiver, like something they have been thirsty for, without knowing they were thirsty. "Thank you, Dr. Reed," she said. "Samuel," he said. "At this point, I think we've reorganized enough medicine baskets together that you might manage my first name." She almost smiled. "Samuel." "There you go," he said, and went back to his patients. Nathaniel heard about the barn consultation from Thomas, who heard about it from the kitchen girl who had helped send the food. He heard that 12 families had attended. He heard that his wife had organized the entire thing. He heard this last piece of information arriving late in the afternoon as he was working through correspondence in his study, that Mrs. Ashford and Dr. Reed had been seen walking back along the Tennant Road together after the consultation was finished, talking with the ease of two people who had found in each other's company something they were in no hurry to give up. Nathaniel set down his pen. He picked it back up. He set it down again. He stood and walked to the window that faced east toward the Tennant Road. Though there was nothing to see from there at this hour except open fields and the distant tree line going dark with evening. He had married Clara Whitmore because she had needed protecting, and he had been in a position to provide it. He had told himself that was sufficient reason. He had organized his feelings around that framework with such long and deliberate practice that he had nearly convinced himself it was the whole truth. Standing at the window, he recognized for the first time that it was not the whole truth. He had married Clara Whitmore because on the one evening he had met her at her father's house 2 months before the Whitmore debts became public knowledge, before Silas Harrow began circling, before everything fell apart. She had sat across from him at a poorly lit table and said with complete and unaffected honesty that she thought his family's banking practice of charging interest on inherited debt was a form of cruelty dressed in legal language, and she had said it looking directly at him, and she had not apologized for saying it. He had been 29 years old. No one had ever said anything like that to him. He had thought about her for 2 months before the situation with her father's debts made action necessary. He had told himself the action was purely practical. He had never stopped to examine what was underneath the practicality, because examining it meant admitting that a man who had spent his entire life believing that emotion was weakness had been quietly, privately, undeniably moved, and that a woman of no particular wealth or social standing had managed to do what no one else had ever done, which was walk past the wall he had built and touch something real. He had punished her for it, not deliberately. He understood that much, not with cruelty or intent, but in the daily accumulation of silence and distance and the steady, systematic withholding of the one thing she had deserved from the beginning. The simple acknowledgement that she was not a duty, but a choice. He had punished her for making him feel something he had never been given permission to feel. That understanding did not arrive with comfort. It arrived the way hard things arrive when they have been held off too long, all at once, full weight, no soft landing. 2 days later, Samuel Reed rode out to the estate to follow up on June Aldridge. He tied his horse at the post and found Clara already at the Aldridges, which did not surprise him. He examined June, who was entirely loudly opinionated about the examination and annoyed at being made to sit still. Her mother laughed for the first time in weeks. "She'll be difficult her whole life," Samuel said to Margaret Aldridge, not without affection. "The stubborn ones usually are. She gets it from her grandmother," Margaret said. "Most of the best things people have they get from their grandmothers," Samuel said. Clara caught his eye across the room, and they shared the brief, easy look of two people who find the same things quietly amusing. And Margaret Aldridge saw the look and smiled the particular smile of a woman who has seen enough of the world to recognize warmth when it moves between people. On the road back, Samuel and Clara walked their usual pace, unhurried the way their conversations always went, moving between practical observations and wider ideas without the kind of careful social management that most conversations required. "How are you, Clara?" Samuel asked. Not the social version of the question, the actual version. She considered it honestly, the way she had learned to do with him. "Better," she said. "Differently than before." "Differently how?" "Before I felt like I was waiting for my life to begin," she said. "Like the real version of things was somewhere ahead of me, and I was just in the preliminary section." She paused. "Now I feel like this is it. This is the actual thing. These families, this work this morning." She looked at the road ahead. "It's enough. It might be more than enough." Samuel walked beside her without speaking for a moment. "That's not a small thing you just said," he said. "No," she agreed. I don't think it is. They came around the bend in the tenant road and stopped. Nathaniel was on his horse at the far end of the road. He was not moving. He sat very still the way he sat when he was doing the thing Clara had come to recognize as his version of controlling himself, the absolute physical stillness of a man keeping something down by sheer force of practice. He had seen them. He had seen them walking close together in the easy, unguarded way that had nothing performance in it, nothing careful or managed, and that ease was its own kind of evidence, and Nathaniel was reading it the way a man reads a document he did not commission and does not like the contents of. Samuel nodded to him. "Mr. Ashford?" "Doctor," Nathaniel said. His voice was even. "Clara?" "Nathaniel," Clara said. There was a silence with real weight in it. "The Aldridge girl as well," Samuel said, because someone needed to say something, and Samuel Reed was a man who had sat with enough difficult situations to know that plain speech was usually the shortest way through them. "Fully recovered. Your wife's early intervention made the difference." Nathaniel looked at Clara. Something moved in his expression that Clara could not immediately read. Not coldness, not the practiced distance she knew so well. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked for a fraction of a second before he contained it almost like pain. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. He looked at Samuel. "Thank you for your work on this estate, Dr. Reed." "My pleasure, sir," Samuel said. Nathaniel wheeled his horse and rode toward the main house without another word. Samuel watched him go. "He's not what I expected," Samuel said quietly after a moment. "No," Clara said. "He rarely is." She watched the road where her husband had disappeared, and she felt that particular ache again. Not the sharp ache of the ballroom, not the hollow ache of the carriage ride home. Something different. Something that had less to do with being hurt, and more to do with the particular sorrow of beginning to understand a man, and not being sure anymore whether understanding him changed anything. She turned away and walked back toward the house. That evening, Nathaniel came to find her. She was in the small sitting room off the east hallway, the one that got the last of the day's light, reading one of her father's old botanical books, the spine cracked and the pages soft with use. The one thing she had brought from home that she allowed herself to call her own without qualification. He knocked at the open door. She looked up. He came in and stood with his hands behind his back in the way he stood when he was uncertain and would not let himself show it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "The tenant work you've been doing," he said. "I wanted to say it has been well done." Clara looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He did not move to leave. He stood there with his hands behind his back and looked at her botanical book and then at her, and she could see him trying to find the door to whatever room he had come in here to enter and not finding it and not knowing how to ask someone to show him where it was. "Is there something else?" she said. Not unkindly. "No," he said. Then, "Yes." Then, "I don't know." Clara had never heard her husband say those words in that order. She watched him. "You seem well," he said finally. The words came out stiff like something that had been drafted and revised and had still not come out right. "These past weeks, you seem different." "I am different," Clara said. "How?" It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man who genuinely wanted an answer and was not sure he deserved to ask for one. Clara set the book down in her lap. "I stopped waiting for permission to matter," she said. "That's the whole of it, Nathaniel. I stopped waiting for this house to tell me I belonged here. I stopped waiting for you." The words were not cruel. They were simply true, and she said them with the clarity of a woman who had found her footing and was no longer inclined to speak at an angle just to protect someone from the direct version. Nathaniel stood very still. "Clara, I'm not angry," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because it's what happened." She looked at him with the steady eyes of someone who has come through the other side of something hard. "I used to spend my days trying to be visible to you, And then I walked out one morning and found that I was visible to people who had nothing to gain from seeing me. And something in me," she stopped, chose her words, "something settled, like it found the ground for the first time." Nathaniel looked at his wife. He looked at her for a long time, really looked the way he had not allowed himself to look, because looking had always felt like the first step towards something he did not trust himself to manage. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded once with the controlled precision of a man absorbing a truth that is costing him something. And then he said quietly, "I'll let you read." He walked out. Clara sat in the last of the evening light with her book in her lap and her hands flat against the cover, and she listened to her husband's footsteps move down the hall and up the stairs, and she stayed very still for a long moment. Then she opened the book and read. Because she had found out these past weeks that she was a woman who could hold both things at once, the ache of what was unresolved and the steady private comfort of who she was becoming, and that holding both was not weakness. It was the most honest thing she had learned about herself in years. 3 days passed after that evening in the sitting room, and Nathaniel did not seek her out again. Clara noticed because she noticed everything about him that was the particular curse of 3 years of careful watching. But she did not wait on it. She rose early. She walked the eastern plots. She brought food to the Coopers and checked on June Aldridge and sat with Mrs. Jennings on 2 separate afternoons, learning the names of herbs she had never needed to know before, and finding in the learning of them a quiet pleasure that had nothing to do with anyone's approval. She was building something. She could feel it the way you feel a foundation going in slowly without ceremony, but solid in a way that nothing built quickly ever manages to be. Samuel came out on Thursday again, and they worked through the afternoon together, and when they finished, he said there was a county gathering the following Saturday at the Patton farm, a summer fair of sorts. The kind of open-air event that brought together half the families within 20 miles for food and trading, and the kind of casual socializing that Virginia summers seemed designed to produce. "I'll be there," he said. "Will you come?" "I expect we'll both be expected," Clara said. Samuel smiled at that. "Expected is one thing, coming because you want to is another." "Then yes," she said, "I want to come." She did not think much more about it until Saturday morning when she came downstairs to find Nathaniel already waiting in the front hall, dressed to go out. And the reality that they would spend the day together in public settled between them with the awkward weight of 2 people who had recently said honest things to each other and had not yet found the new shape of things. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They drove to the Patton farm, in the same carriage silence that had always defined their public appearances, except that this silence had a different texture than before. Before, it had been the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. Now, it was the silence of 2 people who had too much to say, and had not yet worked out how. Oh, the Patton Fair was loud, warm, and full of the particular energy of people who have been working hard all summer, and are grateful for one day when they are not required to. Families spread across the open ground, children running between the booths, men examining horses and tools, women moving in clusters of conversation, that had the complex social architecture of people who see each other at church every Sunday and have long memories for old slights and old kindnesses alike. Clara moved through it with a steadiness she had not possessed at the Harrington Assembly 2 months ago. She greeted people by name, tenant families, farmers, the Aldridges, the Coopers, Mrs. Jennings with her walking stick and her sharp eyes. And they greeted her back, not with the cautious deference of people addressing the estate owner's wife, but with the warmer, more direct greeting of people addressing someone they had come to know. She felt Nathaniel beside her, keeping pace, watching her move through the crowd with an attention she was aware of, but could not fully read. Samuel found them near the food tables around mid-morning. "Mrs. Ashford." He shook her hand, then nodded to Nathaniel. "Mr. Ashford, fine morning for it." "It is," Nathaniel said. The 3 of them stood together for a few minutes in the way that groups of 3 always stand, with the particular geometry of people trying to determine the shape of the space between them. Samuel was easy about it in the way he was easy about most things. Nathaniel was contained, which was how he was about everything. Clara stood between them and felt the strange specific pressure of being the connective tissue between two people who occupied very different parts of her life. Then the fiddle started up on the far side of the ground, a reel bright and fast, the kind that pulled people onto their feet without requiring a formal invitation. And Samuel turned to Clara and said with the simple directness that characterized everything he did, "Would you dance, Mrs. Ashford?" Clara said, "Yes." She did not look at Nathaniel. She took Samuel's hand, and they moved toward the open ground where 3 other couples had already started. And she danced the way she had not danced since before her father's debts had made dancing something that felt borrowed and precarious with her whole self in it. Her feet certain, and her shoulders back, and her face open and unguarded. Samuel was a capable dancer, not elegant but precise, the same quality he brought to everything, and he made her laugh twice in the course of the reel by saying things under his breath that were timed perfectly to the moments when laughter was least expected. From the edge of the ground, Nathaniel watched. He stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, and his face in the expression that people who did not know him read as indifference, and that Clara, had she been watching, would have recognized as the face he wore when something was costing him significantly, and he was refusing to let it show. He watched his wife dance. He watched her laugh. He watched Samuel Reed place one hand at her back with the easy, uncalculated confidence of a man who had no reason to be afraid of touching something that might mean something to him, and he felt moving through his chest like a cold current in summer water, the full and specific weight of what jealousy felt like when it arrived not as vanity, but as recognition. He was not jealous because another man was dancing with his wife. He was jealous because another man knew how to be present with her and he did not, and the difference between them in that particular quality was not small. The reel ended. The dancers laughed and separated. Clara came back across the ground still bright from the movement. Her hair loosened slightly at her temples, and she found Nathaniel standing exactly where she had left him. She looked at him steadily. He said, "You dance well." "I used to," she said. "I think I'm remembering how." Something in the way she said it, quiet, even carrying a meaning that was not quite about dancing, sat in the space between them and did not move. And then, from the far edge of the fair, a voice came through the crowd that tightened everything. "Well, Clara Whitmore, still wearing the Ashford name, I see." Silas Harrow walked through the crowd the way a man walks when he wants people to know he owns whatever room he's in. He was 53 broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of physical confidence that comes from decades of being the largest creditor in a room. He had a magistrate's authority and a creditor's patience, and he had used both for 30 years to accumulate the kind of power that doesn't appear in any single document, but runs through the county like groundwater, invisible everywhere, and impossible to get out of once it gets into your foundation. He had wanted to marry Clara when she was 19, and her father's name was already fraying. He had presented himself to her father as the practical solution, the sensible arrangement. Clara had refused him. Her father, weakened and afraid, had not been able to make her agree. Silas had left that conversation with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to the word no, and had simply filed it away for later. Nathaniel had married her 4 months after that. Silas had never forgotten any part of it. He stopped in front of Clara with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "Heard you've been spending your time with the tenant farmers," he said, "bringing them food, organizing their medicine. That's very charitable." He said the word the way a man says a thing he means to be insulting, without quite committing to the insult. "Given your family's situation, I suppose you have a natural sympathy for people who owe more than they can pay." The people nearest to them had gone quiet. Clara looked at Silas Harrow. She did not step back. That was the first thing, the absence of the instinctive step backward, that the old Clara, the one who had spent 3 years trying to be invisible, might have taken. She stood exactly where she was, and she looked at him with the same steady eyes she had turned on her husband in the sitting room on Thomas, in the estate office on anyone who had underestimated the kind of woman she had become over the past 2 months. "Mr. Harrow," she said with the precise courtesy of a woman who has decided that politeness and yielding are not the same thing. "Good morning." "Is it?" He smiled wider. "Your father's land is still under lien, you know. The Whitmore name isn't exactly what it was. I often wonder what your husband's family thinks about that, having that attached to the Ashford name." "I'm sure you do wonder," Clara said. "You've always been very interested in my family's business." A murmur moved through the people around them. Silas's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes adjusted. He had expected her to flinch. He had expected the familiar, quick drop of her gaze, the instinctive apology, the retreat that women like Clara were supposed to make in the face of public pressure from men like him. He had been reading that script in his head so confidently that her failure to follow it had genuinely surprised him. He leaned forward slightly. "I recall a conversation with your father 8 years ago. That is enough." Nathaniel stepped forward. He moved the way he moved when he had made a decision, and was not interested in discussion, with a completeness of intention that shifted the air around him that made the people nearby take an involuntary half-step back simply from the change in atmospheric pressure. He placed himself between Clara and Silas Harrow, and he looked at the older man with an expression that was not heated, not theatrical, not any of the visible forms of anger that can be argued with or performed around. It was colder than that. It was the expression of a man who has done the accounting and is now simply stating the result. "You will address my wife as Mrs. Ashford," Nathaniel said. "You will confine that address to civil topics, and you will not reference her family's past in public or private again." Silas looked at him with the practiced ease of a man who has stood in front of many people's anger. "Nathaniel, no offense intended to... I know every financial arrangement you have made in this county for the past 15 years, Nathaniel said still, in that same level, uninflected voice. "I know about the Caldwell property. I know about the lien you placed on the Morrison estate 3 months after old Morrison died, and before his widow had legal counsel. I know about the arrangement you made with Judge Peters in 2009 that was not strictly speaking within the bounds of his judicial authority." He paused. "I would prefer to keep that knowledge where it currently resides, which is between you and me. Whether it stays there depends entirely on how this conversation ends." The silence that followed had the quality of a room after a door has been slammed. Silas Harrow looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. The smile on his face did not disappear. Men like Silas Harrow were too practiced for that, but it changed. It became the smile of a man reassessing, recalculating, filing something away, the way he had filed away Clara's refusal 8 years ago. "Always a pleasure, Nathaniel," he said. He walked away. The crowd around them loosened, people turning back to their conversations with the studied casualness of Southerners who have witnessed something significant and are politely pretending they have not. Clara stood very still. She turned to look at Nathaniel. He was still facing the direction Silas had gone, his jaw set, his shoulders held with that absolute controlled stillness. Then he turned to her, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not pride, not satisfaction, not any of the performative emotions a man deploys when he wants to be seen doing something significant. Just worry. Plain and unguarded there for 1 second. Before he contained it, he had been worried about her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something further and was running a calculation about whether he had the right to say it, or how to say it, or whether saying it would require admitting something he was not ready to admit in the middle of a county fair with 40 people pretending not to watch. Samuel appeared at Clara's shoulder. "Well," he said quietly, looking at the direction Silas had gone. "That man has the particular charm of a boot in a wound." Clara let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's one way to describe him." "Are you all right?" Samuel asked the same question Nathaniel had just asked, but asked the way Samuel asked things, simply with no scaffolding around it, just the direct offer of concern. "I'm fine," Clara said. "I've been fine around Silas Harrow before." "No," Nathaniel said quietly. "You haven't." She looked at him. He was looking at the ground, and his voice was flat, with the particular flatness of a man saying a thing he has been carrying for a long time, and is setting down in the wrong place but cannot seem to help it. "You've managed him before," Nathaniel said. "That's not the same as fine." Then he walked away toward the edge of the fair, toward space and air, and left Clara standing beside Samuel with the echo of those words in her ears, feeling for the first time in a very long time that her husband had said something true about her. Here, she found the letter 3 days later. It was not something she was looking for. She was not the kind of woman who searched her husband's belongings. That had never been her nature, and the 3 years of their marriage had, if anything, confirmed in her a deep respect for the private interior of another person, mostly because she had fought so hard to maintain her own. She had gone into Nathaniel's library to return a book, one of the old agricultural texts she had borrowed to understand the crop rotations on the eastern plots, and the book she set on the shelf dislodged something from the space behind it. A folded paper slid out and fell to the floor, and when she bent to pick it up and saw it was not a loose page from a text, but a sealed letter folded around something smaller, she would have set it aside without opening it, except that her own name was written on the outside, not Mrs. Ashford, Clara, in her father's handwriting. She stood in Nathaniel's library for a long moment, holding the paper with the afternoon heat pressing in through the windows, and the house completely quiet around her. She opened it. Her father had written it 2 months before the wedding. The handwriting was unsteady. She could see in the way the letters moved. How much effort it had cost him. How tired he had been. How much the weight of what he was writing was pressing on the hand holding the pen. She read it standing up without moving, the way you read something when you are not sure your legs will hold you when you reach the end. Her father had not arranged her marriage to Nathaniel Ashford. Nathaniel had arranged it himself. Silas Harrow had moved against the Whitmore estate the winter of 1812, quietly legally through a series of debt consolidations and land liens that her father had not fully understood until it was too late, by which point Silas had effectively positioned himself to foreclose on everything and offer Clara's father a single way out the marriage of his daughter. Not to Silas himself, he had long since moved past that particular ambition, but to a business associate of his, choosing a young man from Richmond whose character her father had looked into and had not liked what he found. Nathaniel had learned of it through his banking connections. He had gone to her father before the deadline. He had proposed the alternative. He would assume the Whitmore debts in full, arrange a settlement that kept the land lien from reaching foreclosure, and marry Clara not as a transaction, but as a protection, a removal of the immediate threat, a way out of the corner Silas had constructed. Her father had asked him why. Nathaniel had said he had his reasons, and he preferred not to discuss them. Her father had written in the letter that he had believed the young man meant it honestly, that there was something in how he had spoken of Clara quickly, and then pulling back from it as though he had said more than he intended, that made her father think Nathaniel Ashford was not a man doing a business favor, but a man doing the only thing he could think of to protect someone he had already decided mattered to him. Her father had written, "I am telling you this because you deserve to know that you were chosen, Clara. Not as a remedy, not as an obligation." The obligation came later when Nathaniel could not find the courage to be honest about the first thing. But the first thing was a choice freely made. "I want you to know that before anything else happens that might make you forget it." The folded paper inside the letter was a copy of the original debt settlement document in Nathaniel's handwriting, with the Whitmore estate amount recorded in full. Clara stood in the library for a long time. She read the letter twice. She read it a third time more slowly, stopping at the line about Nathaniel pulling back from something he had nearly said, and she thought about the past 3 years. She thought about the ballroom, and the carriage, and the breakfast table, and the evening in the sitting room, and the fair, and all the 1,000 daily silences that she had read as indifference, and that now, with the letter in her hands, and her father's unsteady handwriting in front of her, were beginning to rearrange themselves into something that looked less like coldness and more like fear. She set the letter on the library table. She sat down in the nearest chair. She was still sitting there, an hour later, the letter open in front of her, when Nathaniel came in. He saw the letter. He stopped in the doorway. The silence in that room was different from every other silence they had shared in 3 years. This one had something alive in it. Something that had been sealed in a wall for a very long time and had just been let out into the air. Nathaniel looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him with the steady, clear eyes of a woman who has just had the ground shift underneath her and is still deciding how to stand on it. "You knew," she said, "about Silas, what he planned for me." Nathaniel said nothing. "You went to my father," she said, "before I ever knew any of it was happening." Clara. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was not loud. It was not accusatory in the sharp public way of someone who wants to wound. It was the plain and direct question of a woman who has been given at last an explanation she was never supposed to have, and who needs simply completely, without performance, to understand. Nathaniel came into the room. He did not sit. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in 3 years. Not in any version of him she had witnessed, because it was the expression of a man who has run out of the particular protection that distance provides and is standing in the open for the first time without knowing what to do with it. "I didn't tell you," he said, "because I didn't want you to feel indebted." "Indebted," Clara repeated. "I knew if you knew the full circumstances you would feel as though you owed me something, as though the marriage was a debt to be repaid instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of what?" Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Instead of what it was meant to be," he said. The room was very quiet. "What was it meant to be?" she asked. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see the war in him. The man who had been taught his entire life that what he felt was a liability, that opening was weakness, that the surest way to protect something you cared about was to never let anyone know you cared about it. She watched him lose the war. "More than it became," he said quietly. "A great deal more than it became." Clara looked at her husband, this complicated, armored, frightened, quietly devoted man who had protected her from a threat she'd never known existed, and then spent 3 years punishing both of them for the fact that he had done it. And she felt something shift inside her that was not forgiveness, and was not anger, and was not the specific ache she had been carrying since the ballroom. It was something older than all of those things. It was the feeling of beginning to see someone clearly. She picked up the letter. She held it for a moment. Then she set it down, stood up from the chair, and walked to the door. "I need time to think," she said. "I know," Nathaniel said. She walked out into the hallway and down to the east sitting room, where the evening light still came in, and she sat in her chair and put her hands flat on her knees, and she breathed slowly in the gathering dark. The man she had been grieving as someone who had never chosen her, had chosen her before she ever knew there was a choice to make. And then, because he was afraid of what that meant, he had spent 3 years making sure she never found out. Clara sat with that for a long time. Outside, the summer evening pressed on, warm, indifferent, full of crickets and dark fields, and the slow turning of a world that did not stop for anyone's private revelations. And Clara Whitmore, who had once gripped a marble railing and heard herself called a duty, sat quietly in her sitting room with the most complicated feeling she had ever held, and held it. She did not sleep that night, not the restless, turning kind of sleeplessness she had known in the early months of her marriage, when she would lie awake listening for sounds that never came and hoping for things she could not name. This was different. This was the wide-awake stillness of a woman whose mind had been handed something too large to set down and too heavy to carry unchanged, and who was simply sitting with the weight of it, turning it over, examining every edge. Her father had known. That was the part that kept returning. Her father had sat across from Nathaniel Ashford and had seen something in the young man's face, something quickly concealed, pulled back like a hand from a flame, and had recognized it for what it was. Her father, who had failed her in so many practical ways, who had let the debts compound, and the land lean close in, and the options narrow until there were almost none left, had still managed to see the one true thing in that room, and had written it down and hidden it inside a book in a library, where she might never have found it. "I want you to know that you were chosen, Clara. not as a remedy, not as an obligation. She got up before the house was awake and went to the kitchen and made herself coffee and stood at the window in the early gray light and thought about the word chosen. She had been chosen. She had been chosen by a man who then spent 3 years behaving as though he had signed a contract, who had given her every material comfort and withheld every human warmth, who had defended her name while refusing to speak it with feeling, who had known about Silas Harrow and stood between her and that threat at every turn. Silently, without acknowledgement, the way a man tends something in the dark because he cannot yet bring himself to tend it in the light. She understood him now in a way she had not understood him before. That was the most inconvenient thing about the letter. It had not absolved him. She was clear on that. Understanding why a man does a thing does not erase what the thing has cost. She had spent 3 years feeling invisible inside her own marriage, feeling the specific hollow ache of being present and unseen, and no revelation about his private reasons changed the reality of those 3 years. She was not the kind of woman who traded her history for an explanation, however true the explanation was. But she could not pretend the letter had changed nothing either. Something had opened in her, a small, careful opening, the kind that happens not when you decide to open, but when the pressure on one side finally equals the pressure on the other, and the thing simply becomes possible. She was still standing at the kitchen window when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. Nathaniel found her there. He stopped when he saw her, the way a man stops when he has been bracing himself for a conversation and finds it has arrived sooner than expected. He had not slept either. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight hollowness around his eyes, the way he was holding himself together with a particular deliberateness. He said nothing. He waited. That was the thing about Nathaniel Ashford. He had always been a man who waited. She had read that as coldness for 3 years. Now she was not entirely sure what it was. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room, not the library, the kitchen with its plain table and its morning light and its complete absence of the social architecture that the rest of the house was built from. And he folded his hands in front of him and looked at her. Clara set her coffee down and sat across from him. "I want to understand something," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, not politely, not carefully, honestly." "All right," he said. "Did you love me?" she said. "Before the marriage, when you went to my father. Did you love me then?" The word landed between them, and neither of them moved. Nathaniel looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I didn't have a name for it," he said. "I'm not sure I do now, in the sense that—" He stopped, started again. "I met you once, at your father's house. You told me what you thought about the interest rates on inherited debt." "I remember," Clara said. "I thought about that conversation for 2 months," he said. "I thought about it more than I thought about anything else. I told myself I was thinking about the argument, the practical point you'd made. But that was—" He paused. "That was not entirely honest." "No," Clara said. "I expect it wasn't. When I heard what Silas was doing," Nathaniel said, "I didn't think about it for long. I knew what I was going to do before I'd finished hearing the full account of it. I went to your father the next morning." He looked at her steadily. "That is not how a man behaves about a business arrangement." Clara held his gaze. "No," she said. "It isn't. I told myself it was practical," he said. "I told myself every step of the way that my reasons were rational, that I was doing what any man of principle would do in the same circumstances. I was very good at telling myself that." He exhaled slowly. "I was good at a great many things that were not in the end true." "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara said. "After. Why didn't you tell me any of it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't know how to tell you that I married you for reasons I couldn't fully account for, without admitting that I was not in fact in control of my reasons," he said. "And I had spent my entire life being a man who was in control of his reasons." "Your father," Clara said. Something moved across his face. My father believed that any feeling a man could not justify in practical terms was a weakness to be corrected, Nathaniel said. He said it directly. He modeled it consistently. He had no patience for men who were moved by things. He had no patience for women either except as extensions of a household's function. He stopped. I am not offering that as an excuse. I am offering it because you asked me to be honest, and that is the honest answer. Clara sat with that. It doesn't excuse 3 years, she said. No, he said immediately. It doesn't. It doesn't excuse the ballroom. No. It doesn't excuse sitting across from me every morning and treating me like furniture you'd been left in a will. He flinched. It was small, barely visible, the kind of flinch that a man who has spent 30 years controlling his face produces when something lands at the right angle to get past the control. But she saw it. No, he said. It doesn't excuse any of it. Good, Clara said. I needed you to know that I know that. She looked at him across the plain kitchen table in the morning light, and she took a breath, and she said the next thing because it was true, and because she had decided during the long night that she was not going to speak at angles anymore, not about any of it. I also need you to know, she said, that I believe you, about my father's letter, about why you went to him. Something in Nathaniel went very still. I'm not forgiving you, she said clearly. That's not what this is. Forgiveness is something different, and it takes time, and I don't have it this morning. But I believe you, and I thought you should know that those are two different things, and I am capable of holding both of them at once. Nathaniel looked at his wife across the table and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, You are a great deal stronger than I gave you credit for. Yes, Clara said. I know. The week that followed was the strangest of their marriage. Nothing was resolved. Nothing had been fixed, declared ceremonially concluded. They had not embraced in the kitchen and announced a new beginning. That was not the kind of people they were, and Clara was glad she had no patience anymore for the performed version of things. But something had shifted. Nathaniel began to appear on the eastern plots. Not dramatically, he did not arrive with announcements or visible gestures designed to demonstrate his transformation to an audience. He simply appeared the way a man appears when he has decided to go somewhere, and he worked alongside the estate crews on the Cooper roof, and walked the tenant road with the same quiet authority he brought to everything, except that now he stopped when people spoke to him. He listened. He answered questions directly. He looked at the Aldridge children and asked them their names. Clara watched this from a careful distance. She was not going to fall back in love with a man because he had started doing what he should have been doing for years. She was more careful than that now. She had built something in herself these past months, something solid and self-sustaining, and she was not going to let it erode because her husband had finally decided to look at the people on his own land. But she watched. On Wednesday, he came to find her at the Jennings cottage while she was helping Mrs. Jennings dry herbs for the autumn medicine stores. He knocked at the open door frame with the slightly uncertain quality of a man who has arrived somewhere he does not usually go and is not certain of his welcome. Thomas says the creek boundary on the north side needs surveying, he said. I'm riding out this afternoon. I wondered if you'd come. Mrs. Jennings looked up from her herb bundles. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Why, she said. Because you know the eastern land better than I do at this point, he said. And because... He paused. I would like your company. He said it plainly, without ornament, with the slightly painful directness of a man who has recently learned that plain speaking is the only kind that does the job he needs it to do. Mrs. Jennings made a small, interested sound and looked at her herbs with extreme concentration. All right, Clara said. They rode out in the afternoon through the thick summer heat, and it was the first time in 3 years that they had gone somewhere together that was not a social obligation with an audience. There was no one watching. There was no performance required. There was only the two of them and the land, and the slow tentative work of two people trying to find out whether they still knew how to be in each other's company when it was not being managed. They talked about the creek. They talked about the North Field's drainage problem. They talked about a tenant family, the Marshes, who had been on the estate since before Nathaniel's father's time and who had a boundary dispute with a neighboring farm that had been unresolved for 12 years. "I'll settle it this week," Nathaniel said. "In the Marshes' favor," Clara said. "In the legal favor," he said. "Which, having looked at the original documents, is the Marshes' favor." Clara nodded. "They'll be relieved." "They should have been relieved 12 years ago," he said flatly, and she heard in it something that was not performed contrition, but genuine reckoning, the specific quality of a man who is looking at things he should have looked at before and finding the view uncomfortable. "You can't fix everything at once," Clara said. "No," he said. "But I can start." They rode in silence for a while after that. The comfortable kind, or close to it, not the heavy silence of avoidance, but the quieter silence of two people who have said enough for now and are allowing it to settle. Then he said without looking at her, "I owe Samuel Reed an apology." Clara looked at him. "I've been—" He paused. "I haven't treated him fairly. He's a good physician, and he's been a good friend to you, and I have not been generous about it." "No," Clara said. "You haven't." "I was jealous," he said with the blunt, slightly uncomfortable delivery of a man confessing something he finds embarrassing. "That's the plain word for it, and I'm not going to dress it up." "You didn't have the right to be jealous," Clara said. "I know. You had spent 3 years treating me like I wasn't worth noticing. You don't get to turn around and be jealous of the first person who noticed." "I know," he said again. "That's why it was an ugly feeling and not a fair one. I'm not claiming it was fair. I'm telling you it was real." He looked at her. "All of it was real. Everything I didn't say. It was real. I had no idea how to say any of it without losing the only version of myself I knew how to be." Clara looked at her husband riding beside her in the summer heat, this man who had been taught by a cold father that feeling was failure, who had loved her in the worst possible way, silently, protectively, from behind a wall he didn't know how to take down, and she felt the complicated truth of caring about someone who had hurt you, which is that caring does not stop simply because the hurt is real. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her. "That doesn't mean it's enough," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking for enough. I'm asking for the chance to find out what enough might look like." Clara held the reins steady and looked at the road ahead. "One condition," she said. "Name it." "Honesty," she said. "Not politeness, not management, not the careful version of things you give people when you're deciding how much of yourself is safe to show." She looked at him. "The actual thing. All of it. I don't care if it's uncomfortable. I don't care if it makes you look like something other than the most controlled man in the county. I need the actual thing." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "That's all. That's everything," he said. "And we both know it." 3 days later, Margaret Ashford crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. It happened at supper. Thomas was there. He occasionally joined the family table when estate business ran late, and the conversation had been moving along the surface of things, land and weather, and the upcoming county court session. The kind of talk that fills a table without requiring anyone to actually be present. Then Margaret set down her fork and looked at Clara and said with the precise measured delivery of a woman who had been composing this sentence for some time, "I heard from Patricia Mercer that you've been seen riding alone with Dr. Reed on the Eastern Road, on more than one occasion." The table went quiet. Clara set down her own fork. "I have ridden out to the tenant families on multiple occasions, yes. Samuel has come with me twice to follow up on medical cases." "Samuel," Margaret repeated, catching the name. "Dr. Reed," Clara said evenly. "As you know." "I know what it looks like," Margaret said. "And so does the county." "Margaret." Nathaniel's voice was quiet. The way it had been quiet at the breakfast table months ago when he had told her that was enough, except this time it had something different in it. Not just the defense of a name, something more personal than that. "I am trying to protect this family's reputation. You are trying to undermine my wife's," Nathaniel said. "In front of her. Again. and I have told you before that I will not have it. I am simply observing that a woman who rides alone with a man who is not her husband has been doing necessary work on this estate while her husband was not paying sufficient attention, Nathaniel said, and the words came out with a directness that silenced the room completely, because it was a man publicly accounting for himself, and no one at that table had expected it. The failure here is mine, not hers, and I will not allow you to redistribute it. Margaret stared at her son. Thomas found something fascinating to look at on his plate. Clara sat very still. Nathaniel looked at his mother with a steadiness that was entirely different from the steadiness he usually deployed at this table. Not management, not containment, but the simple, clear look of a man who has decided where he stands and is no longer interested in debating it. Clara is the mistress of this house, he said. Not because of my name, because of who she is. And I should have said that clearly and without qualification a long time ago. He looked at Clara. I'm saying it now. The dining room held its breath. Clara looked at her husband. She did not cry. She had not cried once in this entire story, not at the ballroom, and not in the carriage, and not in the sitting room with her father's letter, and she did not cry now. She was not a woman who cried at the moments that mattered. She was a woman who went very still and felt things all the way through, which was harder and more honest. She said, "Thank you, Nathaniel." Not the polite thank you of 3 years ago spoken because courtesy required it. The real one. Margaret left the table early that evening. Nobody commented. The following morning, Nathaniel was gone before Clara came downstairs. Thomas told her he had ridden to town. She did not ask why. She had her own work, and she did it walking the eastern plots, and checking the well progress, and sitting with Mrs. Jennings, and thinking in the background of all of it about what her husband had said at the supper table. He came back in the late afternoon. He came straight to her. She was in the east sitting room, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I went to speak with Eli Calloway." She looked up. Eli Calloway was the county's most respected land attorney. "About my father's debts," she said. "About Silas Harrow," Nathaniel said. "The Caldwell property, the Morrison lien, the arrangement with Judge Peters." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her, the same configuration as the kitchen table, the same plain, unperformed proximity. "I gave Calloway full documentation of all of it. He's taking it to the circuit court." Clara stared at him. "Nathaniel, that is if Silas retaliates." "He'll try," Nathaniel said. "I expect he will. I've prepared for it." He held her gaze. "He has been using your family's debt as a way to keep leverage over you for 8 years. He used it at the fair to embarrass you in public. He used it 8 years ago to try to trap you." His voice was even, but there was something running underneath it, something that was not evenness. "I should have moved against him years ago. I didn't because I was protecting the Ashford name from the complexity of the fight." He paused. "I was protecting the wrong thing." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "This could get complicated," she said. "Yes." "He has friends on the court." "So do I," Nathaniel said. "More of them." "You're certain?" "No," he said. "I'm not certain. I'm committed. Those are different things, and I'm done pretending they're the same." Clara felt something move in her chest. Not the small, careful opening of the morning after the letter, but something wider than that. Not yet forgiveness, but its immediate neighbor. The clear-eyed, clear-hearted recognition that the person across from you is finally, and at real cost to themselves, trying to be equal to what you deserve. She said, "Tell me everything Calloway said." And Nathaniel did. He talked for an hour, plainly, completely without selecting which parts were safe to share. And Clara listened the way she listened to everything important with her full attention, asking questions when she had them. And the room went from late afternoon to early evening around them without either of them noticing. And the particular quality of the conversation was so different from every conversation they had ever had in 3 years of marriage that it felt in the best and most disorienting way like talking to someone she was only now beginning to meet. At some point in the middle of it, without either of them deciding to, they had stopped sitting across from each other and were sitting beside each other on the same settee, her father's botanical book on the cushion between them, like a small battered monument to everything she had carried alone. Nathaniel looked at it. "Is that your father's?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. He picked it up with the careful hands of a man handling something that belongs to someone else, and he turned it over once, and then he set it back down. "I should have made sure you had more of his things," he said quietly. "When we married, I should have thought about what it cost you to leave that house, and I should have made sure you had something of it with you." Clara looked at the book. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. Plain as creek water, no embellishment, no hedge. Not, "I'm sorry if you felt," or "I'm sorry that things were difficult." "I'm sorry." Direct and without escape route. Clara looked at her husband. "I know," she said. Outside, the summer evening was doing what summer evenings in Virginia always did. Settling slowly, generously, stretching the light out as long as it could, before giving way to dark. The crickets had started up. Somewhere in the east, one of the tenant children was calling for someone to come in for supper. "I don't know how to do this," Nathaniel said. Not helplessly, he was not a helpless man, but honestly, "I have spent my entire life knowing how to do things. I don't know how to be in a marriage, not the way you deserve." Clara looked at him. "No," she said, "you don't." He winced. "But you're learning," she said. And then, because it was true and she was not going to speak at angles anymore, "And so am I." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the contained, guarded, carefully managed face of Nathaniel Ashford of Ashford House and the county banking interest, but the face of a man who is for the first time in his adult life being looked at clearly by someone who is not afraid of what they see. "What do you need from me?" he said. Clara thought about it honestly. "Keep going," she said. "What you started with Calloway. What you said at the table last night. What you're doing right now." She looked at him. "Don't stop when it gets uncomfortable. Don't go back behind the wall when something feels too open. I've watched you long enough to know that's what you want to do. Close up, manage it. Put distance between yourself and anything that cost you something." She held his gaze. "Don't." "All right," he said. "That's all. That's everything," he said. "And we both know it." She almost smiled. He saw it, that almost, and something happened in his expression that was the closest thing to vulnerable she had ever seen on him, and he held it there deliberately without pulling it back, which told her everything she needed to know about whether he was actually listening. They sat beside each other in the evening light, with the old botanical book between them, and the conversation moved on to ordinary things. The well progress, the marsh boundary, the circuit court timeline, and it was ordinary in the new way. The way things are, ordinary when they have been passed through fire, and come out, the other side, changed but intact. Not fixed, not finished. But something real was growing in the space where the silence used to be slow and deliberate, as anything worth growing rooted in ground that had been honestly turned over for the first time. And Clara Whitmore, who had gripped a marble railing and told herself she was done waiting, sat in the last of the summer light, and felt with the careful and clear-eyed honesty that had become the most essential thing she owned, that she was no longer waiting at all. She was here, and so, for the first time, was he. The circuit court date arrived on a Tuesday in late August, when the Virginia summer had reached the particular peak of itself, the kind of heat that had been building since June and had stopped apologizing for what it was. Nathaniel had been preparing for 3 weeks. Clara knew this because she had been part of the preparation. Not as a decoration, not as the wife who sat at home and waited for her husband to return. With news, he had brought her into it deliberately, the way he had been bringing her into things since the evening in the East sitting room, when they had talked until the light was gone. He had shown her the documents Calloway had assembled. He had explained the legal structure of Silas Harrow's arrangement with Judge Peters. He had walked her through every piece of evidence, not because he needed her to understand it, but because he had decided quietly and without announcement that the wall between what was his concern and what was hers was no longer a structure he was interested in maintaining. "You'll come to the court," he said the night before. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Silas will try to use your family's history in the room," Nathaniel said. "He'll try to make it about the Whitmore debt rather than his own conduct. Calloway has prepared for it, but you should know it's coming." "I've been waiting for it to stop coming for 8 years, Clara said. "I can manage one more time." Nathaniel looked at her. "You won't have to manage it alone," he said. She held his gaze. "I know," she said, and she meant it in a way she had not been able to mean anything about him for a very long time. The county courthouse in Fredericksburg was full by 9 in the morning. This was not unusual for a session involving Silas Harrow. The man had accumulated enough creditors, debtors, rivals, and people he had simply wronged over 30 years, that any formal proceeding against him drew an audience the way bad weather draws people to windows. They came quietly with the careful neutrality of people who wanted to see what happened but were not yet certain it was safe to have an opinion about it. Clara sat beside Nathaniel in the front section. She sat straight the way she always sat, hands in her lap, eyes forward. Beside her, Nathaniel was the contained, certain version of himself, the one that the county read as cold, and that she now understood was the face of a man who was most himself when the stakes were highest, and the performance was least affordable. Silas Harrow sat across the room with his attorney, a thin man from Richmond, who wore his experience like a second coat. Silas himself looked the way he always looked. Settled, assured, the specific confidence of a man who had survived previous challenges and had filed each survival away as evidence that he was essentially untouchable. He looked at Clara when she came in. She looked back at him. She did not look away first. That was new, and he registered it. She saw him register it, the brief recalibration behind his eyes, the slight adjustment of his expression, and then he looked away, and that small, quiet exchange was its own form of reckoning. Eli Calloway opened the proceeding with the calm, methodical precision of a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that the law said exactly what he needed it to say at exactly the right moment. He presented the Caldwell property documentation first, the timeline, the debt notice, the foreclosure proceeding that had moved with a speed that the original loan terms did not legally permit, executed 3 months after old Calloway's death before his widow had obtained counsel. The room was quiet. Then the Morrison lien. Then the arrangement with Judge Peters, documented in Peters' own hand in a letter that Nathaniel had obtained through a connection that Calloway had spent 2 careful weeks cultivating without alerting anyone connected to Silas. When Calloway read the Peters letter aloud, something moved through the room, not loudly, the way drama moves through a theater, but the way a current moves through water underneath and everywhere at once. Silas's attorney objected 3 times in quick succession. The sitting judge, a man named Hargrove from Richmond, brought in for this session precisely because every local judge had some connection to Silas, overruled all 3. Then, Silas's attorney stood and said with the careful timing of a man executing a strategy that had been planned from the beginning, "Your Honor, I would like to speak to the character and credibility of the primary complainant, Mr. Nathaniel Ashford, and to note that his marriage to the daughter of Robert Whitmore, whose outstanding debts to Mr. Harrow remain active and on record, represents a direct financial conflict of interest in this proceeding." The room shifted. Clara felt Nathaniel go still beside her. She put her hand on the bench between them, not touching him, just placing it there, a small and deliberate steadiness. And he looked down at her hand, and something in his jaw released fractionally, and he looked forward again. Calloway was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the Whitmore estate debt is precisely the mechanism by which Mr. Harrow maintained improper leverage over the Ashford family for the duration of this investigation. Far from representing a conflict of interest, it represents the direct injury my client and his family sustained as a result of Mr. Harrow's conduct. If opposing counsel wishes to introduce the Whitmore debt, I welcome the opportunity to explain in full detail how it came to exist and how Mr. Harrow used it." Hargrove looked at Silas's attorney over his glasses. "Do you wish to proceed on that line?" he said. A pause. "No, Your Honor," the attorney said. He sat down. Silas looked across the room at Nathaniel with the flat measuring look of a man recalculating how badly he had underestimated his opponent. Nathaniel looked back at him without expression, with the absolute unperformative steadiness of a man who has done the accounting and is simply waiting for the result. The proceeding continued for another 2 hours. When it concluded, Judge Hargrove ruled that the Caldwell and Morrison matters would be referred to the full circuit court for formal review, that the arrangement with Judge Peters had been formally entered into the record for further investigation, and that a lien freeze was being placed on all active Harrow debt instruments pending that review, including specifically named by Callaway, with the timing of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, the outstanding Whitmore estate debt. The room exhaled. Silas Harrow left the courthouse without looking at anyone. That was how Clara knew it had worked, not the ruling itself, which was procedural and would take months to fully resolve, but the exit. Silas Harrow had spent 30 years leaving rooms like a man who owned them. He left this one like a man who was already calculating what he had left to work with, and the difference was visible to anyone who had ever watched him long enough to know what he looked like when the ground had genuinely shifted under him. Outside in the heat of the August street, several people came to speak to Nathaniel. The county attorney. 2 men from neighboring estates who had their own dealings with Silas that had never been formally challenged. A woman Clara did not immediately recognize who took her hand and said quietly, "My husband lost the Caldwell property. We've been waiting 3 years for someone to bring this forward." Clara looked at her. "It was my husband's doing," Clara said. "And Callaway's. Yours too, I think," the woman said, and squeezed her hand and walked away. Clara stood in the street with the August sun pressing down on her and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since before she could accurately name when it had started. Not relief exactly. Something quieter and more complete, the particular settling of a woman who has watched justice move slowly and imperfectly, and at real cost, in the direction it was supposed to go. Samuel appeared at her shoulder. He had been at the back of the courtroom. She had seen him come in during the second hour, settling into the last bench with the unhurried competence of a man who had figured out where he needed to be. "Well," he said. "That was something." "Yes," Clara said. "The Whitmore debt freeze," he said. "Callaway timed that beautifully." "Nathaniel made sure it was in the petition from the beginning," Clara said. "He told Callaway it was a condition." Samuel looked at her with the direct, clear-eyed attention he brought to everything. "He's not the man I thought he was when I first came to this estate," he said. "No," Clara said. "He's not." "Are you all right?" Samuel asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because she had learned from him the particular value of saying the full true thing, "I'm more than all right. I think I'm actually—" She paused, finding the word. "I think I'm well." Samuel smiled at that. The easy, unperformative smile of a man who is simply glad. "Good," he said. "That's the one I was hoping for." Nathaniel came through the door of the courthouse and found them there, and he nodded to Samuel with the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who had made good on his private promise to himself. "Read," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Samuel said. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said. Directly, without preamble, the same way he did everything now. "I was unfair to you over the summer. The work you did on this estate with the families with my wife, it was good work, and I was not generous about it." Samuel looked at him for a moment. "Apology accepted," he said with the same plain ease. "For what it's worth, your wife did most of the work. I just showed up with the bag." Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "Yes," he said. She did. The weeks that followed the court session moved with the particular quality of things that are changing too slowly to watch, but too significantly to miss. The lien freeze on the Whitmore debt held. Callaway sent word in early September that the circuit court review was proceeding and that Silas Harrow's attorney had already begun negotiating terms, which meant, in the language Callaway used, that Silas knew he was going to lose and was deciding how much he could minimize before the full accounting arrived. Margaret Ashford had been quiet since the supper table confrontation. Not warm. Margaret was not a woman who traded in warmth, but quiet in the way of a person who is making the private recalculation that all people eventually make when the social structure they have been operating inside begins to fundamentally rearrange itself. She had not been unkind to Clara since that evening. She had not been kind either. She had been for the first time simply neutral, and neutral was a great improvement on everything that had come before. And Clara accepted it as such without requiring it to be more. Nathaniel was different in ways that were small, but not small. He knocked before entering rooms she was in. He asked her opinion about the estate decisions that he had previously made, unilaterally, and presented to her as completed facts. When she disagreed with him, he did not manage the disagreement into submission. He argued it plainly and directly. The way two people argue when they are both taking the matter seriously. And twice in those weeks, she had changed his mind about something, and he had said so clearly in front of Thomas, who had developed the expression of a man watching the natural order of the universe quietly rearrange itself and finding it somewhat more interesting than he had expected. She noticed all of it. She did not comment on it. She did not catalog it or offer it back to him as proof of progress. She simply received it because receiving it honestly was more respectful than performing gratitude for something that should have been ordinary all along. But inside quietly, she was beginning to build something she had stopped trusting herself to build. Not the waiting kind of love, the kind she had carried for 3 years, careful and airless, hoping it would eventually be met. Something more mutual than that. Something that had room in it for the reality of who he was, flaws and fears, and the long history of the wall alongside the reality of who he was becoming, which was a man working daily and at real cost to be equal to what he had been given the chance to have. The Harrington Assembly came around again in September. The same hall, the same polished floors, the same tall windows, the same fiddle music that had been playing the night Clara stood at the marble column and heard her husband reduce their marriage to a duty. 1 year. Almost exactly. Clara dressed with more care than she usually brought to it. Not for the room, not for the audience, but because this particular evening had a specific weight and she wanted to meet it honestly. She wore a deep green dress, one she had ordered in August, with the particular quiet intention of a woman who knows something is coming and wants to be ready for it. Her mother's pearls at her ears. Her hair simply pinned the same as always. She came downstairs. Nathaniel was waiting in the hall. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her more often recently, fully without the managed distance, with his eyes actually on her, rather than in the general direction of whatever the social situation required. He had been practicing it, she thought, or perhaps unlearning the habit of not doing it, which amounted to the same kind of effort. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said. Then, "So do you." He offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked out to the carriage together, and it was different from every other time they had walked out of that house together in 3 years. Not because anything had been declared or resolved or formally concluded, but because the quality of the silence between them had changed. It was the silence of two people who have things to say and are choosing when to say them, not the silence of people who have given up. Yeah, the assembly was full. The same county families, the same social geometry, the same careful exchanges of information dressed as pleasantry that had always characterized these evenings. Except that tonight, people greeted Clara differently. Not dramatically. Virginia society did not traffic in dramatic reversals that was too visible, too much of an admission that the previous position had been wrong. But the woman who had always received the careful, measured greeting of a person whose welcome was conditional now received something else. Mrs. Harrington took her hand and said her name first before Nathaniel's. The Aldridges. Gideon and Margaret cleaned up and proud attending. For the first time, Clara could remember crossed the room specifically to speak to her. The woman from the courthouse, Steps the one whose husband had lost the Caldwell property, found her near the windows and squeezed her hand again. Clara moved through the room with her back straight and her shoulders open and the particular ease of a woman who no longer needed the room's approval to believe she belonged in it. She had stopped needing that somewhere in the summer, she thought. Between the morning she first walked out to the Cooper field, and the evening her husband had looked at her from across a supper table and told the truth. Nathaniel stayed near her. Not in the hovering, performative way, not a man demonstrating he had learned a lesson, but present. Actually physically, socially present, the way he had not been for 3 years of these gatherings. When people spoke to her, he listened. When she spoke about the tenant families and the well project, and the Aldridge child, who had nearly died in July and was now running through the cottage rows, terrorizing dogs, he listened to that too, and added things, and looked at her with the expression of a man who is discovering that the person he married contains more than he had allowed himself to find out. Margaret arrived late and stood near the edge of things, as she had begun to do. Then the fiddle started up. The same reel, or one close enough to it, that the sound landed on Clara with the full specific weight of a year ago, the marble column, the cold railing, the sound of her husband's voice telling a room full of men that she was nothing more than obligation. She stood very still for a moment. Then she felt Nathaniel's hand at her elbow, not gripping, not claiming, simply there. And she turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and that she understood now was the expression he had been keeping behind the wall for 3 years. Not composed, not managed, not any version of the face he showed the county, or the court, or his mother, or the social structures that had defined him. Just him. "Dance with me," he said. 2 words, the same weight as "I'm sorry." No ornament, no escape route. Clara looked at her husband. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago gripping the marble railing. She thought about the morning she had risen before sunrise and walked out to the Cooper field, not knowing what she was walking toward, only knowing she was done, waiting for permission to matter. She thought about Mrs. Jennings, and June Aldridge, and the herbs, and the well, and the long summer of building something solid in herself, that no amount of silence or coldness or public humiliation had been able to dismantle. She thought about her father's letter. "You were chosen, Clara." The first thing was a choice freely made. She thought about the kitchen table and the east sitting room, and the ride along the creek and the courthouse, and all the small, daily, deliberately honest moments of a man working to become equal to what he had always privately already known she deserved. She looked at Nathaniel Ashford. "Yes," she said. He took her hand, not her arm, not the formal social architecture of a man escorting a wife, and he walked with her to the center of the floor, and the fiddle moved into the reel, and they danced. It was not a perfect dance. Nathaniel was not, it turned out, a natural dancer, and Clara found this unexpectedly and completely delightful, because it meant he was doing something he was not certain of in public in the middle of the county assembly because she had said yes. He held her hand, and he moved with her, and he did not look at the room. He looked at her. Only at her. And the room, the county, the careful Virginia social architecture, the women who had always treated her as a footnote, and the men who had taken their cue from her husband's posture. The room watched Nathaniel Ashford dance with his wife in the middle of the Harrington assembly floor, and what they saw was not a man managing a social obligation. What they saw was a man who could not look away from the woman he was with. When the reel ended, Nathaniel did not release her hand. He stood in the middle of the floor and said, not quietly, clearly, in the tone he used when he intended to be heard, "I want to say something." The music paused. The room shifted into that particular listening quality that comes over a crowd when a man of consequence speaks without the preface of an announcement. Nathaniel looked at the room. Then he looked at Clara. "Most of you know that my wife has spent this past summer working on the eastern tenant plots," he said. She organized the medical consultations with Dr. Reed that caught the fever outbreak in the Aldridge family before it spread to the wider community. She directed the well repair that prevented a water shortage that would have affected 6 families through the winter. She repaired relationships between the estate and the tenant families that I had let fall into neglect. He paused. She did all of it without being asked, without recognition, without her husband showing a fraction of the attention and respect it deserved. The room was very quiet. Clara stood beside him with her hand in his and looked at his profile, and felt the particular ache that comes not from being hurt, but from watching someone be more honest than they have ever been at real cost in front of everyone who matters to them. I called this woman an obligation once, Nathaniel said. In this room, a year ago from that corner. He did not look at the corner. He looked at Clara. I was wrong. I was wrong about what she is to me, wrong about what I owed her, and wrong about the kind of man I had been choosing to be. He held her gaze. She is the reason Ashford House is the place it is this year, rather than the place it was last year. She is the most capable, most honest, most genuinely good person I have had the privilege of knowing. And I am asking her in front of all of you to believe that I understand the difference now between what I gave her and what she deserved, and that I intend to spend however long she allows me making that difference smaller every day. The room was completely still. Clara looked at her husband. She felt the year behind her, all of it, the marble column, and the carriage silence, and the breakfast table, and the sitting room, and the letter, and the summer mornings, and the courthouse, and every conversation in which she had slowly, honestly, at the cost of the easier versions of herself, become the woman she was standing as right now. Nathaniel, she said. Yes, he said. He was still looking at her. Only her. That was a very long speech, she said, for a man who didn't used to say anything. Something happened in his expression that she had been waiting to see for 3 years, open, unguarded, lit from inside, and he laughed. Really laughed, in the middle of the Harrington Assembly floor, in front of the entire county, with no management of it at all. I had a good teacher, he said. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest, over the carefully pressed coat, over the contained, armored, finally opening heart of the most complicated man she had ever known, and she said clearly, and without any angle to it, "Take me home, Nathaniel." He covered her hand with his. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They left the assembly early. Nobody commented. Or perhaps they did. The county would have its opinions as it always did, and those opinions would move through church pews and kitchen tables and front porches for weeks. Clara had stopped caring about that somewhere in July, and she found that not caring about it had not in fact made the world fall apart. It had simply made the world smaller and more real. In the carriage they sat on the same side. She was not sure who had moved first. It did not seem important. The road back to Ashford House was the same road it had always been, through the same summer dark, under the same half-moon that had been there a year ago, when she had sat across from her husband in the silence of two people who had everything between them and were not saying any of it. She sat beside him now, and felt the particular fullness of a moment that is not the end of something, but the real beginning of it. Not the declared beginning, not the announced one, but the quiet and honest beginning that happens when two people have done the hard work of becoming honest with each other and are finally ready to find out what comes next. Nathaniel's hand was over hers on the seat. They did not talk on the road home. But this silence was different from every silence that had come before it, because it was the silence of two people who know they will talk later tomorrow, next week, for as long as they are given, who have all the time they need, and no longer feel the need to rush toward it or fear being kept from it. Ashford House appeared at the end of the drive, lit from inside, the way it always was when the staff kept the lamps burning until the family returned. It looked different than it used to. Not the building was the same, but something in how Clara received the sight of it had changed. It was not the house she had arrived at 3 years ago, feeling like a charity case, given a key, and told to be grateful. It was not the house she had spent 2 years trying to make herself visible inside. It was the house she had made her own room, by room, morning by morning, choice by choice. The east sitting room and the kitchen table and the library and the long walks to the Cooper field before sunrise. She had not waited for Ashford House to accept her. She had simply, stubbornly, gracefully claimed it, one act of honest living at a time. And now the man who owned it, who had always, it turned out, wanted her to have it, was sitting beside her with his hand over hers, and the house at the end of the drive was lit warm against the August dark. They went inside together. The door closed behind them, and Clara Whitmore, who had once pressed her palm flat against a marble column and held herself together by will alone while the music played on without her, walked through her own front door, with her husband's hand in hers. And she was home, and she knew it, and she did not need anything or anyone to tell her so. The woman who had been called an obligation